Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's a good evening from my side of the planet.
Good evening here as well.
Yes, good evening.
I see everybody coming in nicely. So we've got 22 people so far. Okay. Hello, Jessica. And hello, York. Okay. Yeah, welcome, everybody. As many of you may know, today, well, it's not really today, but like today, next week, Psychreative will turn 1. So this is the 12th and the first anniversary of Psychreative with its 12th session. And I want to thank you all for making this a wonderful monthly event that we all look forward to. I've met some amazing people, and I want to thank you all for this wonderful sense of community that you have all contributed to. And to mark this first anniversary, we have a very special guest with us, Adam. Hello, Adam. Adam Wyeth joining us from Dublin. And as you all know, Adam's talk is titled Depth Literature, Irish Myth and Modernism. In this talk, award-winning poet, playwright, and essayist Adam Wyeth will introduce his new book, About Blank, his most ambitious and experimental work to date. About Blank, published by Salmon Poetry 2021, and which premiered at Dublin Theatre Festival 21, as an audio-immersive play, is a genre-fluid, shape-shifting piece which weaves together a series of interconnected narratives moving across poetry, monologue, and dialogue. Adam writes that he thinks of it as a kind of dreamtime text, a 4-part poetic sequence which travels across various interiors, episodes, and mythic dimensions of Dublin. Adam will discuss in detail his writing process in which About Blank was created. Rather than imposing a plot-driven linearity, while writing, Adam held firm to the idea of spontaneous image making. The work started with tapping out paragraphs rhythmically on his keyboard, a form close to automatic writing. He then pursued these pieces symbolically, discovering a mythic method to the madness. Adam soon discovered that far from these pieces being meaningless, they were in fact overflowing with meaning, patterns, and connections. Adam will also talk about Irish myth and how various Jungian principles played a major part in the shaping of this work. In attempting to write about this process, Adam has coined a new term, which he calls depth literature. Like depth psychology, depth literature refers to a literary approach while exploring the subtle, unconscious, and transpersonal aspects of human experience. A depth literary approach may include literary traditions of myth, metaphor, psychology that explores the unconscious and involves the study and exploration of dreams, complexes, archetypes, and individuation. So many of you may know Adam. Adam is an award-winning and critically acclaimed poet, playwright, and essayist with 5 books published with Salmon Poetry. In 2019, he received the Kavanagh Fellowship Award. Adam is the author of Silent Music, highly commended by the Forward Poetry Prize, and The Art of Dying, an Irish Times Book of the Year. In 2013, Salmon Poetry published his essays, The Hidden World of Poetry, Unraveling Celtic Mythology in Contemporary Irish Poetry. This book is used as a teaching tool around the world and has been officially added to 2 DePaul University classes in Chicago. Books for Celtic mythology and books for contemporary Celtic literature. Adam's plays have been performed across Ireland and also in New York and Berlin. His play, This Is What Happened, was published by Salmon in 2019. His 5th collection, About Blank, is a large 4-part poetical sequence which blurs genre, moving across poetry, prose, and dialogue. In 2020, Adam was selected for the Abbey Theatres Ireland's National Theatre Engine Room development program, where he worked on About Blank as an audio-immersive piece. Subsequently, he received the Arts Council Ireland Literature Project Award to complete the project. About Blank premiered at Dublin Theatre Festival in 2021. Adam is also a recipient of the Live Music and Performance Scheme for a new music and text work in collaboration with Emmy-nominated composer David Downs, performed by pianist Rolf Hind and cellist Adrian Montu. Adam is an associate artist of the Civic Theatre, Dublin, and works on ideas and research for the RTE Poetry Program. He teaches online creative writing correspondence courses at adamwyeth.com and fishpublishing.com. Adam has also developed a unique and accessible series of talks and creative writing workshops called The Mythic Imagination for participants of all writing levels. So Adam, we want to welcome you, and we want you to know that we are very honored to have you with us tonight. And without further ado, we would like to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rula. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Okay, I want to say thank you to you for just all your generosity and enthusiasm about my work, and it's a real thrill to be here this evening, or whatever time zone you're on, and to talk to you about these sort of passions of mine. And so, yeah, I'm really delighted to connect in this way, and hopefully we might all be in the same room together one day as well, talking about these things, and over a pint of Guinness or something like that. So yeah, I'm just going to dive in about what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to begin talking about sort of music and writing. Before I took up writing, I used to play percussion instruments such as congas, djembe, then classical tabla. I see a common thread between the flow and pattern of playing music and imaginative writing. The source of most of my work now comes from a Word document on my computer called Write Rubbish Speed Writing, where I allow my unconscious to wander wherever and however it wants to go. It started off as a space to limber up before the proper writing, but I find nearly all my work comes out of this document now. When my writing follows this kind of aesthetic course and forgets about meaning, it allows for something interesting to occur. I often equate my writing process with throwing my toys out of the cot and then trying to assemble them into some semblance of order. Something spontaneous and mysterious has to happen before the later work of developing and shaping takes place. Once something is on paper, I can then investigate and scrutinize what's happening. In many ways, writing is working backwards, working out what on earth has happened. Writing is often like sneaking up on myself when I'm not looking. What is injected doesn't always stay, but it presents other resonances, layers, and contrasts. I've always admired musical artists who don't rest on their creative laurels, seeking new forms of expression and often defying expectation, such as Bob Dylan and Radiohead. Dylan famously went electric and Radiohead went electronic. After the success of Radiohead's seminal 1997 record OK Computer, frontman Tom York had enough of anthem rock and wanted to take his music in an entirely different direction. In 1999, the five-piece spent 2 weeks in Copenhagen recording endless bits of music, taking their inspiration from the German experimental rock band Can, who would jam endlessly in the studio and then edit the music down to the very best parts. This process of working would eventually lead to Radiohead's most experimental record, Kid A, still considered one of the most important albums of the new century. Without being aware of it, I was discovering something close to this jamming method through writing. It started with tapping out paragraphs rhythmically on my keyboard, sometimes as if I wasn't even writing at all, but playing an instrument. Other times I'd be driven by a voice or trying to shape a vague image into something more concrete. I was not concerned with fitting any particular genre and allowed the text to move across various styles, exploring atmospheres, textures, and layers of pattern and sound. I then started to edit these pieces down and patch them together, assembling them into a kind of word mandala. This way of working forced my conscious self to get out of the way and listen more acutely to the work. Instead of looking for meaning, I allowed meaning to find me. It also helped upset the logical linearity of writing, which is often in fear of becoming predictable and pedestrian. Out of these first stirrings, certain themes started to suggest themselves. As Rula said, rather than imposing a plot-driven linearity, I held firm to the idea of spontaneous image making and then pursued these symbolically, discovering a mythic method to the madness. Whether we know it or not, we all live by our own personal myths, these archaic and primal patterns which are buried within the unconscious. The great comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell believed that there are 4 kinds of hurdles or tests along the road of trials, which brings the individual towards self-realization. The first is the symbol of the erotic encounter with the perfect beloved. I discovered these principles were naturally nestled in the work, so I started to tease them out. One myth which kept connecting was Percival, legendary knight of the Round Table. Over the years, I've discovered that many of these mythic conflicts arise precisely because we're cut off from some part of our inner life. Later in the writing process, I started to zone in on these parts that related and resonated with various aspects of myth and depth psychology, most notably Carl Jung's theories on anima-animus development. By staying true to the circular form and rhizomatic roots, I gained further insight within the happenings from this song of the other self. While writing about blank, I became increasingly interested in dreams. I was struck by the similarity between dreams and literature. Mythological stories, like our dreams, evoke images that bridge the gap between the conscious and unconscious. As an image arose or recurred in the writing, I would start to think about its symbolism as one might consider it with a dream. It's only a matter of time before a cat in the night under a moon starts to take on an archetypal presence in a story or poem. For instance, the opening of part 1 concerns itself with a missing cat called Rosie, which, alongside other facets, suggested aspects of the rejected feminine. This type of reading helped to define a shape for the work and started to reveal aspects of the inner life as well. At the same time, I was cautious not to try and solve or resolve anything too readily. The trick in dream work is to listen, note down, and then communicate with the image, archetype, character, and see where this might lead, rather than force it down any one corner. I later discovered this form of writing is very close to what Jungians call active imagination, where you begin a dialogue with a figure or image from your dream. In attempting to write about this work, I came up with a new term that best sums up the writing process for me, which I've called depth literature. Previously, I'd been using the term mythic imagination and then Eliot's term mythic method, which he first used when reviewing Joyce's Ulysses. As well as referring to myth, depth literature includes psychological resonances of depth psychology, which more accurately encapsulate my method of working, particularly regarding the relationships between the conscious and the unconscious. Like depth psychology, depth literature refers to a literary approach while exploring the subtle unconscious and transpersonal aspects of human experience. A depth literary approach may include literary traditions of myth, metaphor, psychology that explores the unconscious and involves the study and exploration of dreams, complexes, archetypes, and individuation. There's always a danger when talking about one's work that it limits it to one meaning. To quote archetypal psychologist James Hillman, we sin against the imagination whenever we ask an image for its meaning, requiring that images be translated into concepts. The driving force from the start of About Blank was to escape any single or glib definition of what the work is about. Although there are intertextualities and philosophical musings within the work, there was no concept I was trying to prove. Neither was I attempting to write some pseudo-psychological or mythic work. The piece had to stand on its own aesthetic 2 feet. About Blank for me is an exploration into creativity, which I suppose at its simplest level is the idea of making something out of nothing, while being cognizant of the fact that nothing comes from nothing. About Blank continues to share new insights with me. Even though I don't believe in writer's block or think it's a precise enough term, I had been at a crossroads creatively. Finding the freedom to write rubbish helped ease the pressure from creating the next poem, story, or play. It put me back in touch with the more playful and instinctual aspects of imaginative writing. I wanted to sweep aside some of the handed down literary dogmas, the flat earth character plot formulas, and challenge the notions of how a book is supposed to look. Could I apply some of the more abstract and interpretive elements which we freely accept in music and visual art while still engaging readers? Images are promiscuous and will always sleep around. I happily flirted with these well-trodden fictional forms without shacking up with one of them for too long. Trusting this open relationship, I allowed the image, symbol, myth to take the lead, and for one thing to lead to the next. This, in many ways, is nothing new in poetry, where the central tenet has always been metaphor. But never before had I handed over so much of myself in a piece of this size and range. Polyamory is not for everyone. Moments of exhilaration were equally matched with disorientation and doubt. Metaphors are slippery things. As Harold Pinter wrote in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, sometimes you feel you have the truth of a moment in your hand, then it slips through your fingers and is lost. Poetry is most at home on this numinous and amorphous plane, which is both immanent and transcendent. A poetical work can act like a suspended prism ball, each angled surface opening a different perspective, which splits the light and sends out a spectrum of color. Drawing a ring around any image and shining a spotlight on it takes us closer to essence. Like working with images placed in a mandala, any object, a stick, a coin, a car, a cat, can be placed in the center of the mystery circle to serve as a perfectly proper source for meditation. The mystery of the existence and non-existence of the cat may be identical with the mystery of the existence of the universe. Paradoxically, I discovered that far from these pieces being meaningless, they were in fact overflowing with meaning, patterns, and connections. Each of the 4 parts of About Blank are an oblique reference to the 4 seasonal festivals in Irish mythology. Part 1, Summer's Death, Seedful, alludes to the Celtic New Year of Samhain. So part 1 begins at the end of October on the eve of Samhain, which we know as Halloween. At Samhain, the ancient Irish believed a gap opened up in the earth. This is the gap between the end of one year and the beginning of the next. The supernatural beings make their presence felt by coming through these gaps. These are the beings from the invisible otherworld that exists alongside us. Nowadays, we call this otherworld the unconscious. The gap in part 1 takes place in the speaker. Out of the blanks of the unconscious, 2 primary figures are created, Stephen and Claire. They exist in Dublin, but outside of time, like gods or otherworld beings. They are the dream fantasy figures from the inner life, or the fictional characters in the writer's mind. These gaps occur at certain stages in our life, and Samhain symbolizes the periods of transition and chaos, or a period of loss of meaning and purpose. Just as winter is part of the natural cycle of the year, so is death and endings part of the natural cycle of our life. At these times, the underworld of the unconscious opens up within us. This necessarily fallow period gives way to new life the next year. These natural cycles reflect the psychological cycles within us. Celtic myth shows us the back and forth between the conscious and unconscious worlds. The 4 seasonal Celtic festivals, which frame the sections of About Blank, pick up on the seasonal goddess, symbolizing the death and rebirth of the crops. These elements pick up on the hidden and layered worlds buried within words, showing how ancient origins carry a mythic dimension. All this connects to the psychological framework, the feminine ambience, and other aspects in About Blank that tie into the collective unconscious. The title About Blank comes from a text that sometimes appears on a slow-loading web browser. It's the universal URL for a blank web page. I won't go into these aspects for this talk, but just to say it's a nod to the prevalence of computer technology on how the internet influences our lives and informs our thinking and our ever fractured lives. It suggests a space between connection and disconnection. There's also the subject of cybernetics, which feeds into the work, the comparative study of the control system formed by the brain and nervous system and such mechanical and electronic information and control systems as computers. A quick example of this is that at the end of writing About Blank, my computer of 10 years died suddenly, and I was left with nothing but the following text, which appeared on my screen. verbose mode, startup, optimistic warning, too many couples being created, chain mask, mismatch, Darwin bootstrapper, optimistic dad, couldn't block sleep, legacy slip, unsupported client, terminate couples, channel changed, promiscuous mode made, boot immediately, hash free, warning, EFI clover, FIP post integrity, found text, free cache, reboot, journal replied done. I found my computer's final words so compelling that I quickly scribbled them down, and it became a found poem in About Blank, which appears when the character of Claire passes out. Here then is a direct way in which the imaginative text and computer in which I was working on connected in an active dialogue. Jung pointed out a possible psychophysical oneness of all life phenomena, and this corresponds also, I think, with ideas of parallelism in psychology. But back to the title About Blank. Interestingly, the etymology of blank comes from Old French meaning white, which in Old English relates to wheat. So out of blank comes wheat, which forms the basis of our agricultural myths. One of the oldest pre-Celtic Irish myths is the Cailleach, or the Hag of Beara in West Cork. Each summer for the last few years, I've had the privilege of spending a week on the Beara Peninsula teaching Irish poetry and Celtic myth at Anamcara Artist Retreat. The Cailleach is a corn wheat goddess and is the embodiment of the land. She represents the three aspects of the feminine: young maiden, mother, and old crone. The Cailleach is also the sovereign queen with whom the mortal aspirant for kingship must have union if he is to rule. The roles all illustrate the mother goddess function and the associations of nature and fertility. The collective psyche is not something we acquire as a result of our personal history, but rather as a consequence of the history of the species. In this, it is permanent and continuous, and like the Irish goddesses, cannot die as she passes from one generation to the next. Another spontaneous and recurring image in About Blank is the car. The car in many ways is a quotidian and central image of modernity. As the car kept appearing in the work, I started to think of the circular form and circle imagery in the work, such as the moon and the coin and the steering wheel and the driver holding this once sacred circle in their hands, and all the poetic, mythic resonances that come with that. I was reminded of the ancient Celts who used to bury wheels with their dead, perhaps to take on their journey to the underworld. In turn, the wheel is buried inside our psyches, as all myths live inside us and move through us. Now, rather than worshipping the sun wheel, we hold it in our hands and are under the illusion that we are in complete control of our fate, the unconscious. The car image comes to a head in Part 3's one-act play, The Wrongs and Rights of Grosvenor Square, the title of which comes from Bram Stoker's bourgeois protest poem about omnibuses disturbing the peace of its residents. The character, Maeve, tells the story to a neighbour in the garden who remains almost entirely silent throughout the play, about nearly being knocked down by a car as she spots her future husband looking at her. "I could have died," she says, "but instead I fell in love." When Stephen in the play talks about history and people staying frozen in time, he picks up on a feedback loop of history that fails to establish a learning process, which is then cursed to endlessly repeat itself. The almost silent neighbour in the play, who Stephen and Maeve call a writer, as she sits on her bench writing in her notepad intermittently throughout, represents this unconscious part. Like the unconscious, she remains in the shadows, and yet she records the conscious worlds about her by writing during the play. As Stephen and Maeve have abandoned the unconscious, they're not living their truth. Both writing and silence then become a form of activism. The couple are terrorized by this invisible, silent world. They can only make sense of the concrete structures they have lived by and are haunted by the unconscious, the shadow world. Their missing daughter and writer next door threaten their world of so-called rational order. The more composed and composing writer here represents the fourth stage of Jungian anima development, consciousness, or in mythic terms, the wisdom of Sophia. Sophia, as the highest feminine ideal, is identified with consciousness. Consciousness is simply a witness. Consciousness doesn't do anything, it just reflects what is put before it. The writer is both calm and actively engaged. She records and responds without being reactive. Her writing is a sign of strength and durability. The moment in the square will pass, but the words will live on. The failure to accept ourselves is a pervasive theme in human beings. The desire to change others is very often the refusal to accept them and a violation of the individuality. So the lost daughter in the play, even from the other world or the unconscious, holds power over the parents. Their one-sidedness leads them to project their shadows on the writer next door, who's increasingly taken to be a threat, even though in reality, she simply sits quietly in her own garden. In his troubled mind, Maeve's husband, Stephen, also turns her into a statue goddess, his idealized other, rather than seeing her as a real individual. Stephen and Maeve's final tragedy is they look everywhere for change, hope, love, meaning, except in themselves. This is perhaps our strongest tragedy. Each section of About Blank traces this progress from the metafictional narration and loss of meaning in part 1 to the interior investigation and development of part 2, which comes together as the writer herself writing in part 3 and 4. The two poems which bookend the work both stand outside the main body of the piece, while also marking its progress. The first poem, Untitled, is about an alien, a newly arrived emigre who has no voice yet in the city he has moved to. The final poem, The Great Friend, follows the story of how Rumi, as a young Muslim scholar, transforms into a mystic and poet when he discovers a new voice forming inside him after a deep loss. This transformation marks the double birth myth. We are born first in the physical world, and the second birth happens within us. The virgin birth of religion and myth are simply symbols of this. This integration and even individuation is finally symbolized in the last line of the poem, where the new moon is described as smiling in the wings. Rumi is able to keep looking at the outside world until the outside world is no longer outside, to quote a line from part 1. The Kayuk, or Hag of Bearer, is a fine example of an internal and eternal goddess. She both lives within us and is symbolized by the natural world, the seasonal cycle of birth, death, and renewal, which happens all about us. When we're able to establish a conscious awareness of the relationship between these archetypal figures, we're able to stand back from the situation and witness, as the writer does in Grosvenor Square. The writer records and creates using the written word, becoming a symbol for yielding to unconscious matters without giving in. Transcending right and wrong, this ambiguous position creates a state of alertness and surrender to the great mystery. It is not for one force to rule over the other, but the ability of holding opposites, which opens up to psychic integration of opposing forces, or to use Jung's term, an individuation of the self. One final aspect I'd like to finish on is the sense of place in About Blank, and how place, in this case Dublin, becomes part of the mythic world and forms much of the architecture in the work. Early Irish literature contains a large corpus of material called Dín Seanchas, meaning power of place in Irish, or law of place, as in L-O-R-E. Dín Seanchas consists of poems and tales relating to place names and their meanings. Many of the place names encountered in these early writings are heavily laminated with legend, which often imbues them with an allure that heightens their significance. This coating of toponymic lore and legend can stimulate the imagination to responses beyond the merely visual, so that ordinary places are transformed into evocative, imagined landscapes that are often at odds with the geographical realities. Linked to these ideas around the lore and power of place, I had in mind John Montague's brilliant poem, A Lost Tradition. In the poem, Montague recalls the Irish landscape of his childhood as a manuscript which we have lost the skill to read. The ancient Gaelic language and culture is represented only by the shards of a lost tradition. Here then, we see all the psychic ramifications that come with the loss of language and culture. A disempowerment of place takes place. In her introduction to About Blank, the poet Jessica Traynor correctly describes Dublin as a major character in the work. The ideas of psyche and city intermingle throughout the work. Just as we may draw the word wheat out of blank, so we can look at the etymology of the word Dublin to draw out more symbolic significance. The name Dublin means black or dark pool, referring to the river Poddle, which was the main source of drinking water for the city for more than 500 years, from the 1240s. The Poddle rises in the southwest of the Dublin region and flows into the River Liffey at Wellington Quay in central Dublin. Aside from supplying potable water for the city to the 18th century, to homes and to businesses, including breweries and distilleries, the river also provided water for the moat at Dublin Castle, through the grounds of which it still runs underground today. This dark pool running underneath also runs beneath much of About Blank. Far from being an accurate mapping of Dublin, as Joyce boasted with Ulysses, Dublin in About Blank is more about this dark pool underworld, symbolizing the shadowy sense of otherness which deepens towards principles of the anima. Part 1 prologue ends with these lines: "A woman is coming for me, as large as the city. This is what happens when we look out of the window all of the time, everywhere, now, in Dublin." The dark feminine water world beneath comes up again a few pages later in these lines: "She closes her eyes, we are all in the dark, rivers, canals, coastlines, the whole city looking the other way. She sleeps in me as I sleep in her. I will be the city one day, and then I'll be let back into the black of her." When Stephen, in part 1, sits by the Grand Canal in Portobello and spots a woman, Claire, on a bus, he's propelled to write poetry and compares her face to a new penny in a fountain. A couplet from this section goes: "A penny, if any, for where do they go? Our thoughts, like old water, continue to stir." The next day, Stephen takes the poem to a workshop in Rathmines, Dublin 6. Feeling let down as his poem is pulled apart and he realizes he's not the poetic genius he thought, he drops the tatters of his battered poem into the Grand Canal, where all his watery letters bleed into one vanishing word, a blinding blank. Around this time, we return to Claire, who is taking a shower. Stepping out, she feels lightheaded and has the sensation of being lowered down a deep well when she collapses. Similar to the dark pool beneath, the ocean is also symbolically linked to the unconscious, as it's described as not being at the end, but underneath everything. Towards the final section, part 1, the narrative returns to the Grand Canal in Portobello. The speaker crosses the bridge over a body of water, and we see a girl in a crop top lying under a willow with headphones on, tapping her feet to a silent beat and drawing an invisible circle around her belly. A few lines later, a mute swan glides by, disturbing the water's surface, before returning back to the pellucid mirror as if it had never been. The closer we look, the less we can distinguish between surface and reflections. In this section, the speaker sits next to an elderly woman on the canal, and he catches her image in the water, rippling out of the weeded bank. Her features refined and redefined by each undulation before settling back. The feminine body here is described as an old map contained in a glass cabinet through which no words could penetrate, all her treasures locked safe inside. We are firmly in the mythical at this point, and spoiler alert, it's revealed that the missing cat, Rosie, has in fact drowned in the loch. Here again, we have the connection of the feminine personification of Ireland lying under the city in these lines. She returns some nights when the streets are empty. When the moon rises, I look for her, my little dark rose. And then at last, the ground gives way beneath. It is a river. The skin of the water is not a mirror, it is a door. Rosie, the missing cat, black cat, links up to the black roses which appear in part 3's play, The Wrongs and Rights of Grosvenor Square. The name Rosie and the black roses are in fact an oblique reference to Roisin Dove, meaning little dark rose. Roisin Dove is one of Ireland's most famous political songs written in the 16th century during the Elizabethan conquest, marking the final end of Gaelic rule in Ireland. But before becoming a metaphor for Ireland, the song is based on an older love lyric, which referred to the poet's beloved. The intimate tone of the original carries over into the political song, which is often attributed to the Irish language poet Raftery, who is often called the last of the wandering bards, but the song almost certainly predates him. In the wake of the Elizabethan conquest, Raftery's loss of status and resultant destitution are direct parallels to the death of the bardic tradition in Ireland and the subsequent near extinction of the Irish language. It was this pathos which drove him to pen much of his poetry and to fully develop the ashling form. Ashling is a traditional Irish language form of poetry, meaning dream or vision, where, like Roisin Dove, Ireland is revealed in female form. Typically, in an ashling, the female figure appears as the poet is out walking and stumbles upon a woman from the other world. Or perhaps the poet, overcome by fatigue, falls asleep under a tree, and the supernatural being comes to light behind parting clouds. She is a sparevan, meaning sky woman, mostly young and beautiful, but sometimes old and haggard, who laments the current state of the Irish people, the dwindling Celtic values in a rapidly anglicised world, and predicts an imminent revival of their fortunes. Again, before being politicised, the ashling was most likely inspired by the fertility goddess. It then later became an ode in code, a shrouded proclamation, subverting the conventions of courtly love into protest song. These feminine forms in Irish language poetry, who come both as muse and as a personification of Ireland, led me on to the Faustian eternal feminine, and of course Jung's principles surrounding the anima. The couple, Stephen and Maeve, are surrounded by roses as they are painting their black garden railings, the roses of course being a central symbol of love. The flowers also link to the mandala imagery within the square, which Maeve describes as moving in circles. Ashling is also the name given to the missing daughter, who we never see in Grosvenor Square, but who Stephen and Maeve try to speak to on the phone. She is the dream vision in the play for Stephen and Maeve. But are they dreaming her, or is she dreaming them? Or is this the dream of the writer next door, who in her near silence has a vague otherworldliness to her? In a more reflective mood, Stephen talks about a language writing us. He constantly keeps connecting the writer next door to his daughter. Returning to the car one last time, Stephen reveals, telling his neighbour, "We had a daughter. She used to write. She'd never be apart from her pen and pad. We were in the garden painting the railings when we got the call. She phoned in the middle of the road just after it happened. There was no ceremony. We decided against it. None of the tis of last offices, no song, and certainly no eulogy. But I remember the wind rustling the leaves like a tramp sifting through rubbish, repeating the same words without meaning, pure thought, a wind of things that can never be pinned down. She was never quite herself, never quite settled, always turning things over like a filthy tramp." Then in a low voice under his breath, "The world within a word, unable to speak." It is the role of the anima to lead the man into the unconscious, and in this to force him to deeper recollection and increased consciousness. Despite Stephen's hostility towards his daughter and contempt for poetry, he also falls naturally into the poetical and mythical language with these lines, which we assume are his daughter's. "One day the sun will be as cold as the moon," she said. "Numinous goddess and luminous stone, a milk-white transience, transparent as net curtains, a stony silence afloat in infinite space, and all the roses return to a tight-lipped black." At the point of this invocation, marriage bells ring out beyond the square, and the stage directions describe a marriage of opposites, wedding bells, I should say. It is as if Stephen, at least subconsciously, senses that the old order of the king, ruled by a one-sided masculinity and rationalism, is waning. This is also symbolized by the sun imagery in the play, which has been behind a cloudy haze. The feminine archetypal moon is on the rise with the writer. This picks up on the quote I used at the start of the book by psychologist Robert A. Johnson, who writes, "The feminine will return. Across the seas, Isolde is waiting. And when Isolde comes, the self-satisfied patriarchal world will never be the same." The play ends with Stephen and Maeve talking to their daughter on the phone, who we must assume is dead. Stephen's final words to her are, "Nothing's changed, nothing's changed, nothing's changed." But despite their denial, there is a clear change. The approaching storm that has been threatening throughout has arrived. And I'll just finish by reading these final stage directions that mark the end of the play. Lightning flashes, the thunder roars like a great cat. Darkness descends on Maeve and Stephen. The writer grows brighter, a heavy downpour approaching. She rises to the changing moon. The eye of the writer dissolves in the writing, branching off into various parts. The myth looks over the shoulder of the writer, the writing, and the written. White noise becomes overwhelming. This combination creates an invisible architecture, transcending spatial and oral definition. The rite of birth through death squares the circle. The end brings out a curious epilogue in which the writer at last becomes the action. The length of time this position is held is a private contract between performers and audience to be negotiated internally each time, which will inevitably shape and determine the blank out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adam. This was beautiful. And I must say, About Blank is a really, really gorgeous work. And I highly recommend that. I know everybody who's here would really, really enjoy it. So thank you so much for your insight. Thank you for the lovely connections and for the beautiful way that you read the anima. We will leave the floor for questions now. But before that, I also want to point out that Adam has a wonderful prose piece in Indelible's forthcoming issue, which will be out on March 8th on International Women's Day. So it's a beautiful, surreal piece called Log Lady. Adam, would you want to say something about it, or would you want to keep it a surprise?
Well, I mean, it's a very it's very anima inspired, and it was interesting because I went and did the Camino in September, and I literally just signed off on, you know, anyone who's brought out a book knows the last minute going through the proofs and everything is really fraught, but this was particularly fraught because there's in About Blank, there's so many weird kind of, I mean, we had all sorts of this is the cover, by the way, and it's a panther. Well, I mean, I haven't talked about half of the things in the book. This is the Panthers Eye, and of course the panther is Rilke's panther, and it's also the panther in Ulysses, the dream. So all of that is, the feminine is all in there as well, and the cat, of course. But within the book, there's like, I don't know if you can see, there's lots of sort of experimentation with text and things, and it kept, everything was going wrong. But anyway, I finally signed off on it. And so walking the Camino, it's weird because you know a book for I've been writing it for God knows how long, 2 or 3 years, but as I sort of finished it and I had it in my head, there were other aspects of it that I hadn't realized which were sort of coming through. And I think you know, when you talk about these things and you're looking at it, it becomes very cerebral and you can intellectualize these things, but you forget actually these things are very real in your life. And so I think there's a very sort of real anima encounter that sort of happened while I was doing this retreat, doing the Camino, which I hadn't expected to have this sort of spiritual experience. But of course, the Camino is all about that. But it was a residency. But anyway, so it ended up being quite an intense and interesting period.
It's beautiful, and I mean, in the piece itself, that you're right, it does reflect that this was kind of a journey into the anima and back. So it's like the treasures that you brought back from the journey.
Yeah, and of course, Log Lady, I should say, refers to David Lynch's Log Lady in Twin Peaks. So there's lots of Lynchian, and I think Lynch as well is so much anima in his work. You know, it's kind of all about that, I think, in many ways, and the light and dark aspects, the marriage of opposites. Well,
thank you again, Adam. And if I may, just one more question that you might want to, that I think many people would also like to hear the answer to, but how did you come across Jung? Or how did Jung come across you?
Well, I mean, I got years ago. I mean, I remember he was, I came across his work probably when I was about 17, and I had just like one of these introductory sort of books on Jung. So that was when I was first introduced to him. But then at that point, I wasn't really a writer or anything. I was just becoming interested in these things. But so he's always sort of been there in the background. But I think it's only been in the last, I suppose when I started becoming more interested in Irish myth and sort of looking up the psychological aspects of those, that's when I started reading more and more psychology and depth psychology, and then coming across people like Hillman, and people like that who and Hillman was a big influence in this book as well. He has some interesting things to say on the car. So he kind of fed into that aspect of the steering wheel, and that, you know, and what that means in society. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for making this this much needed synthesis between Jung's ideas and the literary world and creativity in general. So, I'm going to take a look at the chat box here, but I would like to invite anyone who has a question to ask or a comment to make to just raise their hands, preferably using the raise hand button so we can see them. Susan. Hello, Susan.
Hello, Adam. Wonderful to hear about your work and these kind of very deep psychological experiences in the processes of writing. I'm wondering about your sense of Celtic myth as something that also extends beyond Ireland, because as you will know, the Celts are pan-European. You may not have come across a poet that I think you would find very familiar. His name was Edmund Cusick, and he died before he was able to publish a great deal, but he was working with Celtic myth in Wales. I'm working with Celtic myth in London. And of course, you know, they were a pan-European culture. They came from the East, and so there is a lot going on there in terms of the deep heritage.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, is that the question? Is that it?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
it.
I'm wondering if the Celts, the bodies that you mentioned, mean Ireland to you.
No.
Or whether you have a bigger sense of that.
Well, I think I've lived in Ireland for over 20 years, so half my life now, and I was introduced to it really. I only kind of learned about Celtic mythology when I came to Ireland, but when I wrote this book, The Hidden World of Poetry, Unraveling Celtic Mythology and Contemporary Irish Poetry, it was really me kind of reclaiming that in a British way, because of course, like you say, the Celts were all over Europe. They came from somewhere around Iraq. So I mean, they're everywhere. You know, Paris is a Celtic word, Venice is a Celtic word. You know, and I think Ireland is fascinating because historically, even though it was, you know, the Elizabethan conquest and it lost its language, and, you know, around after 1601, the Battle of Kinsale, of course, England went through that 1066, and many, you know, but Ireland was never Romanized, so it retained its Celtic identity a lot longer than the other European countries. But I think it was very much, when I got into Celtic mythology, it was like I was trying to reclaim it back and say, well, this is part of us, you know. And the venerable Bede, of course, you know, there's that huge connection, but there is no difference in that sense between Britain and Ireland. And of course, I think Heaney was touching on that when he was translating Beowulf. He was showing how connected these things are, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I of course I understand the point that Ireland wasn't Romanized, nor were the extremities of Britain, but London in many ways is a very Celtic city, and you know, it's good to see those connections that go deeper than the kind of modern sense of these different nations.
Yeah.
But it is a wonderful thing to kind of blend the Celtic with the Jungian, because as you will know, having read Hillman, there is a great deal of absorbing of the classical world into Jungian ideas, and getting other mythologies in there is, I think, very important. So thank you.
Yeah, oh, thanks. Well, it's lovely that I have that connection.
Mm.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Susan and Adam. We have another question from Jessica. Jess?
Hi, Adam, absolutely wonderful presentation. I loved hearing about your work. I work in a very similar way in the sci-fi and fantasy genre, actually. And one thing that interested me was you're linking your practice to active imagination. And I find it really difficult. I'm not saying you're calling what you're doing active imagination, but like akin to it. And I wanted to ask you, is there another way of phrasing it? Because I find active imagination, but I wanted to ask you more about how you work conscious to unconscious, because when I work with the unconscious, it's like you, it's this sort of dialogue between, you know, open and images, but then also I see you bringing in literary and mythic metaphors and sort of almost Easter eggs to people, like you're saying about Lynch. And that's how I work as well. But I always sort of stop short of calling it active imagination in the Jungian sense, because that seems to be more a kind of a reaching out to the unconscious in a pure way. So, but it does really feel like this dialogue. I mean, when I was plotting something, I had to be quite close with the plotting in a conscious way, because otherwise there would be huge plot holes. So it was very much a kind of a negotiation between what the unconscious wanted and what my conscious wanted. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think active imagination, I think there's many ways of sort of talking about active imagination and looking at it. And I think isn't every form of fictional imaginative writing some kind of form of active imagination? And I think Jung talked about it being sort of quite artistic in that sense, you know. So I mean, you've got the more therapeutic way of using active imagination, as in the Jungian sense, that if you're working on a specific dream, there's a sort of that element to it. But then there's the purely creative side, and yeah, I mean, so that was it for me, though. It was when I'm writing, so look, if I'm working on a dream, I obviously don't care how it sounds or anything like that, and I'm not going to pursue it and turn it into some poem or something. It becomes about creating some kind of dialogue with whatever it is I'm communicating with. And but I think in the sort of more poetical sense, in this Write Rubbish document, I'm thinking more about sound and rhythm, and I suppose I'm feeding on the sort of poetical tools that I have, and sort of getting into some kind of flow with the rhythm, so that those aesthetic things are taking place. And sometimes that doesn't happen, though. Sometimes it could be complete rubbish, you know. Sometimes I could be just hammering something out just to get something out in some shape or form, but something is, I don't know, so I mean, that's my way into it, or it was with this. And then like I say, it's working backwards, then trying to work out what it is, and finding the bits that work, and, you know, a kind of collage thing takes place. You know, when I wrote this new piece, Log Lady, it's got no punctuation. Well, the first bit's got punctuation, and the rest hasn't, and it's just this kind of, I just had to, it just kind of came out that way, and I found it repeating phrases and this sort of thing, and it was just a build. I just had, it came out, it wanted to come. I was trying to find a form for what I was feeling, and that was, you know, so that those sorts of things married, you know. And I suppose Beckett was an inspiration in that sense. But Pinter Pinter writes so openly, actually, about his writing process, and I love every bit of his writing, including his own prose on writing, and he talks about how you can only force characters so much when you're working, and you try and get them to do things and they just won't do it, so you do, and so there's always that energy that and you kind of, I suppose, like anything, how does a painter know when, what they can add and those sort of things? You're balancing all those things all the time of what you feel you can crowbar into the piece without it looking crowbarred. That's the thing, is like, if it's got all those things have to sort of taking place, I suppose. Does that answer something?
That's very helpful. Yeah, I always go back to, of course, Jung's metaphor of alchemy, that that process of development, but also, thinking about your rhythm, which is very different to mine, but I love, is it felt almost shamanic, the sort of the drumming, the ritual, the rhythm. So, I don't want to be sort of culturally appropriative in that sense, but that's suddenly what it reminded me of. But thank you, it's really informative.
Oh, thanks so much for your question.
Thank you, Jess. Is there anyone else who would like to add something? Ray, yes, go ahead.
Yes, you mentioned a woman who appears to the poet, and I think the pronunciation was Aisling something. How is that spelled?
Aisling is AISLING. So you say it like Ash, ASH, but it's
Right.
AIS. Yeah. So it's
Right.
it's a name in Ireland as well. It's quite a popular name. But it means, in Irish, it means dream or vision. And like I say, it's a form of Irish language poetry. So yeah, that's and like I say, the play Grosvenor Square is really a kind of Aisling, as I see it. Nobody probably gets that, but it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next.
Did someone say, is it Jessica Steele? I wonder if Adam has ever heard of Dr. Sharon Blackie, who is a depth psychologist, writer and academic who works a lot with British and Irish myth, including using the phrase the mythic imagination. No, I don't. In fact, yeah, it's always lovely I'm writing down all these names you give me, because I love to come across new writers.
I just found her recently, actually, because I'm really interested in Indigenous Britain and Indigenous Ireland, and looking at the myths and the lost traditions of that. So yeah, she looks really interesting. I think she'd be interesting for your work.
Thanks, Sharon. I'll check her out.
I really liked what you mentioned about cybernetics, Adam. That was very interesting. And it reminded me of the work of Bryony. Bryony, you're still here with us? Yep. So Bryony has also previously given a presentation on this, the fascinating aspect of the AI world and our interaction with it as well. So I can't find Bryony. Oh, there you are. Okay. Well, hi, Bryony. This is just a little shout out to you. Is there anyone else who would like to ask Adam anything or comment? We have some new messages here. Susan says, in my writing, I would see AI in the way characters sometimes talk back. Huh.
Yeah, I do think active imagination does happen in in the creative process, and so I would see it as Adam kind of proposed, really, and I certainly experienced it when working with characters who suddenly started behaving in a way that I didn't expect or didn't even want.
Yeah.
So it's like they have a life of their own.
Yeah. And having a active imagination or Jungian ideas, it is a language for that phenomena, which writers have known about for centuries, that sometimes it starts to get away from you, or things come in that want to be there that you hadn't consciously thought of.
Yeah.
And that's terribly exciting, and often becomes some of the most valuable parts of what it is that you are writing.
Yeah.
My book actually features the triple goddess as a detective, and
Wow.
it's a one could start with kind of mythic figures, but very often, as you said, Adam, you kind of discover more mythic layers as you carry on.
Yeah, definitely. And it's wonderful to hear that from you, Susan. Obviously, you're far more of an expert in the field, so it's nice to hear that connection. I must check, what's your, is it a novel, this?
Yeah, it's called The Sacred Well Murders.
Okay.
Here it is.
And
You can see it here.
Oh, great.
It is actually, it's wonderful that we're paired together like this, Adam, because The Sacred Well Murders will be the April Psychreative.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, great. Well, I look forward to it. Yeah, I must read it. Yeah, and I am, and it's interesting, all the sort of mythic dimensions, because for me it's I think the sort of for me it's not so much the sort of the fantasy, when you talk about myth, it often goes into the sci-fi fantasy world, whereas I think the dungeons are in our homes and the dragons are in our hearts. So it's very much for me the psychological kind of unwrapping and sort of bringing those things down to earth, which is
that's exactly what Jung said in his essay on literature. As you know, he talks about the eagle being an aeroplane, and so we're in the kind of mythic imagination, whether we know it or not.
I mean, we've lost the language of symbolism, which the ancients had, I think, and that's, I guess, if there's a sort of didactic thing, that's something I'm trying to sort of bring back, is getting us to sort of understand the world of symbols, even among poets. I mean, it's like, I've often thought this, that like poetry can do anything, in any, poetry's, it's gone through so many experimentations and movements, but can you have a poem that doesn't have a metaphor, and that's, and yet, I think that is the element, that is the hallmark of poetry for me anyway.
That's right. And I feel that people get metaphor wrong because they see it as something added, whereas in fact, it's the kind of essence of writing. And very often people talk about metaphors where they actually mean metonyms. I've got some bits of writing on this, particularly on the symbol and active imagination and close reading. If anybody here is interested, I'll put my email address, and if you let me know, I'll send folk a chapter or two on this from my Jungian literary criticism book. Because Jung is really good about the symbol. He basically restates that the symbol is the portal into the collective unconscious and into mystery. And the way we use symbol today to mean a sort of code for a known set of meanings, that's not what it's about at all.
Yeah, it's a lovely way of looking at it. I mean, I think that's what's so wonderful about Jung, is it is so poetical, isn't it? It's it's very beautiful in that sense.
Well, I've been arguing for years that Jung wrote non-fiction novels, that's what the collective works is. But the Jungians don't like it when I say that.
Oh, really?
Not the clinicians.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is Susan's Jungian literary criticism book, for anyone who's interested and doesn't have it. And this is The Sacred Well Murders, which we will be discussing in our forthcoming Psychreative session, which will be on April 30th. Is that the 30th, Susan, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so it's the last Saturday of April. Okay, we have a question from Bryony, who cannot use the microphone because she's using her phone. Adam, this was wonderful. Can you discuss more perhaps how glitches have fed into your work? I see their text glitch as a kind of chance poetry.
Yeah, there's always a bit of chance going on, isn't there, in a piece of work? And I'm always fascinated by that, you know, how you might be listening to something, a podcast or something on the radio, and something someone said suddenly gives you an idea. And I think that's part of being alert to creativity, and certainly being alert psychologically to the outside, you know, that it's not just looking at dreams and this kind of separation, that everything feeds into it, you know, when you're sort of on the qui vive in that way. And this is all the synchronistic kind of elements that go on in your life, you know. And it's so yeah, so the glitches like that, like the computer dying, you know, how that kind of fed into the piece, and all those sort of happy accidents along the way are kind of, in fact, I mean, I think they start to happen so much in your creativity that you stop seeing them as extraordinary. They just become part of it. You know what I mean? There's probably so much of it going in, and there's so much stealing as well, that you're sort of, it's all mixed into it. You know, I'm a great believer in you know, Eliot's idea of you know, immature poets imitate and mature poets steal. You know, because I think it's part of the sort of almost folk tradition, you know, that it's not even about, it's not stealing, it's not the same as plagiarism. I see it as it's a conversation, you know, becomes part of that, you know. And I think Dylan is a great example of that, and Shakespeare, of course, a great example of how you can steal and borrow, but it's still part of your own genius, your own work, that sort of, if you understand what I mean. But glitches, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've had my fair share of glitches when writing, and they drive me nuts. I expect them all the time now. You know, once when I just finished writing my book and I wanted to submit the manuscript, I lost the text. I don't know what happened. It was lost.
Oh my God.
And yeah, and it took me hours to find it again. And I was working on Google Drive, which is supposed to save things. And then it was just nowhere to be seen there. So I actually had to contact Google. And they took me into this cyber world and told me to press things and screenshot others. And then until I finally was able to capture the manuscript back and save it from the underworld that it was in.
Yeah,
so
and that happened with, like, it was literally the day before going to do the Camino that I signed off on About Blank, and the proofs were going kind of fine. It was good, and then the editor sent me this one version, and everything had mucked up. And it was like, at that point she was saying, "Oh, just have a quick read, it's all done." And it was like, and I looked at it, and it was like, you know, so it just got crazy, and so I was terrified that this. I didn't know, you know, so, but yeah, so all of those things are, yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Yeah, we expect them now all the time. So I keep saving my stuff here and there.
Yeah, I do, and email it. Like even this talk tonight, I emailed it just in case the computer suddenly died, and then I put it on my Kindle as well.
Yeah, that always works.
Yeah.
That always works.
Yeah.
I see Nassim's hand raised. Nassim, go ahead.
Yes, hello. I'm very happy to have stumbled into this talk. I just maybe make a brief comment. I know the psychoanalyst Rollo May describes the creative process as a kind of encounter with the material before the artist, which I think is a really alchemical idea, because of course the alchemists had this sort of imaginative aspect to their work, but they were also dealing with the sort of physical chemistry in front of them, figuring out how to interpret that, work with it. I think according to that framework, the writer sort of has the most difficult job in a way, because the material they're working with, the written word, is this strange kind of malleable thing. It's difficult to sort of figure out exactly what its influence is. And so I just love this element in your work of bringing in like the computer as a kind of material, this sort of point of resistance, sort of outside that you really, you know, sometimes the computer crashes and sends you these crazy messages, and that's this sort of speech from outside almost that shapes the work. And I thought that was such a wonderful sort of alchemical idea. I just wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, cool. And I'm glad you mentioned Rollo May, because I just was reading Man's Search for Himself, and he touches on cybernetics in that, and because there's a little mention of cybernetics within the piece as well. And so I was really glad of that you mentioned it in the Jungian sense, which made me actually add that little bit we talked about. So thanks for that. Yeah, and the whole, I mean, it's weird as well, because like this title About Blank was a joke, because the other thing as well with me is like I'm very conscious, particularly in like the theatre world, that we write, when obviously theatre, it's the reflection of what's going on in society and that sort of thing, but it can be done in a very superficial way, and often is, I think, that there's a topic in the news and therefore we want to play about this, and and it can be very superficial, I find, when you do that. And actually, so my whole thing was that I wanted to write something that was about nothing, so it was this joke title, but it just kind of stuck, a bit like the About Blank thing that gets stuck, the loading web page, and yeah, and all those glitches, what that kind of means as well. And I haven't written so much about that side of it, but it's those things are sort of all in it as well. But thanks for your comments.
Thank you, Nassim. And Adam, I think About Blank is just a brilliant title, by the way.
It's not original now. I found there's a poet called Tracy Fuad who brought out a collection of her first collection. It's called About Blank. It came out the same time as this About Blank, and I've actually made contact with her because there's similar themes that we're exploring in the work. It's different in many ways, but there's similar things. But I thought that was kind of extraordinary.
That's a synchronicity.
Yeah, for sure. We'll have to get her on Psychreative. Right.
Yeah. Susan says great minds pick up on deep themes. Absolutely. Okay, would anyone else like to take the mic? I guess we can take one more question or comment before moving to the second half of the session.
I saw
Anybody else?
Cassie's comment, poetry image, I believe, which is great. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess that's it. Right, so Sarah, I'm gonna hand it over to you. Thank you so much, Adam, for your talk, for your brilliant ideas, and for answering the questions and for the wonderful conversation that followed. Well, and we look forward to, I've read it already, but everybody else I'm sure would love to read your forthcoming piece in Indelible. Adam will also be giving a little workshop and session at the Indelible Festival of Literature, and his session will be on April 12th. So I'll be sending out an email with all the details and the Zoom links and the full program and schedule, but we hope to see you there. So once again, thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.
And Sarah?
Amazing.
Yes, thank you so much, Adam. That was just wonderful. I am going to share a piece of mine that is going to be in the upcoming Indelible, and I see a lot of themes from what you just shared, so I think it'll be a really nice transition. And then once I finish with mine, however much time we have left, I guess we'll do sort of an open mic if anybody has poetry that they want to share, or short form prose. So. And speaking of glitches, for some reason, my cursor has disappeared on my computer. So I have a touch screen, so I hope I'll be able to do what I need to do with the touch screen. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to share this short presentation with you. It'll be in the upcoming Indelible, like I said, and the theme there is the feminine. So this is a piece, most of the artwork in this is from DeviantArt. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but and then I have one of my pieces of artwork at the very end, and it's also in the new indelible. So this is from a personal story, personal experience of mine. It's called Grief and Hope, A Heroine's Journey. The day before Thanksgiving 2013, my mother was rushed to the emergency room with a brain aneurysm. After her initial treatment and diagnosis, she lay unresponsive in a coma-like state for just over 7 weeks. It was a time of unending uncertainty. My mother, though her body was with us, felt very far away. Any of the hope I held on to mixed daily with grief and anger. My father and I tried to give a daily update to everyone involved. In return, we received stories of the past and hope for the future. The stories sustained us. When women get together, they tell stories. This is how it has always been. Telling stories is our way of saying who we are, where we have come from, what we know, and where we might be headed. In this tenuous time, the stories held us together. My mother, grandmother, and I have been involved in the practice of dream work for many years, so these narratives comprise many of the stories. Many dreamed of my mother as she lay in her liminal state. One of the feelings that came forward was a sensation that, in some way, we were on this journey with her. We were bearing some of the burden of traveling to the other side, to the depths, to the underworld. The story of any woman is also the story of a goddess. Myths and their characters rarely stand alone. They are constantly intertwined and interacting with other archetypal energies. At that time, the myth of Psyche and Eros came alive in my life. In the original version of the myth of Psyche and Eros, the story is centered on a young, beautiful woman named Psyche. The goddess Aphrodite grows jealous of the attention that Psyche receives for her beauty and tells the people that Psyche is to be wed to a monster. So she's taken to a mountaintop and left as a sacrifice. Once on the mountain, her bonds are cut and she finds herself in a beautiful palace, visited nightly by her bridegroom, but never allowed to see his face. Eventually, in her loneliness, she requests that her sisters visit. They do and become jealous of her situation. Hence, they devise a plan. Psyche is to take to bed a knife and an oil lamp. She will light the lamp, see the monster, and kill him, and then return home. Psyche does as she is told, but when the lamp is lit, she sees she is wed to a beautiful god, Eros, the god of love. In the same moment, Psyche pricks herself on his arrows and spills a few drops of the hot oil on his shoulder. Eros awakes in pain to see his love standing over him. Trust broken, she has seen his true guise. She flees from the palace, and in his absence, the structure vanishes. Psyche is left alone on the mountainside, pining for her love. Psyche comes to understand that the only way to get her love back is to complete impossible tasks laid out to her from Aphrodite. Aphrodite sets the task of sorting piles of grain, retrieving the golden fleece, and bottling water from the river Styx. In each, she is helped to complete these tasks by invisible forces and spirits of nature, tendrils of compassion for her plight. Finally, Aphrodite tells Psyche that she must take a box to the underworld to collect a cosmetic from Persephone. She almost completes this task, but tempted by the mysterious box, she opens it and is hit by a sleeping draft. She falls to the ground in a death-like sleep. Eros, who is now healed from his burn, picks her up, returns the sleep to the box, and pricks her with his arrow to wake her. In a more modern retelling of this tale, Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis, The focus is on the relationship between the sisters. In this version, the tale is told by Orwell, Psyche's older, homely, veiled sister. It is a beautiful story. Orwell is as much a mother as she is a sister to Psyche. She loves her dearly. In this telling, the sister was not jealous, but worried for Psyche. She encouraged her to view her husband out of love and concern. And when she discovered the consequences of this action, she grieved for Psyche's loss. She was on the mountainside when the palace disappeared. She saw Psyche wander off into the wilderness weeping, but could not reach out to her. So as Psyche is off performing her task in the realm of the gods, Orwell is keeping the kingdom running and building a community as the queen. With Psyche forever on her mind, she continues searching for her for years. As she grows older and is nearing death, in her travels, Orwell hears the telling of the classical myth of Psyche and Eros. She hates the gods for taking Psyche away, for keeping her unaware of Psyche's trials, and for her inability to help all these years. In the final part of the book, we see what goes on during this period. In her very last days, Orwell slips away and enters a dream realm. She has waking and sleeping visions of Psyche. In these dreams, she is a tiny ant helping to sort great piles of grain. She is in the field of the golden sheep, where she draws their attention and is trampled. She sees Psyche in the distance, gathering the fleece by the river. Eventually, she has performed all the tasks, lived into the various guises of nature that help Psyche in her trials. Orwell's life is split between her constant love and search for Psyche and her duties as queen. For one to flourish, the other had to be put aside, put into the underworld. For the period that my mother was hospitalized, I felt this split as well. The queen had more and more a part in me, and Orwell had less and less. I locked her up, or laid her to sleep as best I could, somewhere deep down inside me. She lay curled there. As I locked my emotions away, I was still touched and moved by the community of women who surrounded me. As I stood resisting the cry in my soul, others around me wept and hoped. In many ways, they carried that burden for me until I was able to return home to break down on my own. They bore the anguish, but I achieved the tasks. The impossible tasks of daily life in the midst of grief. In this way, I was Psyche. I was Demeter. I was the queen. Over the course of the journey, the tasks I completed with the help of the queen were numerous. But always, Orwell lay curled underneath. Sorting came from the separating out of the different hats I had to wear: caretaking daughter, diligent employee, loving wife, concerned grandchild, studious scholar, caring friend, and on and on. Though the story in waking life played out very similarly day after day, one day at the hospital, my father remarked that he felt like we were in the movie Groundhog Day. Even the clock on the tower outside the hospital window was stuck at a perpetual 5 p.m. The narrative continued moving forward in dreams. I have a huge breakdown. I'm screaming and crying. I go to my analyst and I'm horrible to her, so angry and sad. After the appointment, I make my way home, still very emotional. The following day, Mama wakes up and is a stunning young woman in her late teens. She has no memory except basic skills. She begs to be flipped over in the hospital bed. I call the nurse. They flip her onto her stomach, and immediately, the bed she is on turns into a bed of glowing light. She lays in comfort on her stomach. The next day, she is sitting up in a nice bed. She smiles because she remembers me from yesterday. I introduce her to my grandmother. She does not seem to have a memory of us before now. This dream came to me a little over a week after the aneurysm. I awoke in tears, wrote it down, and thought very little about it. I was still in queen mode. The only image from the dream that struck me was my mother on that glowing bed. To me, this became like a numinous emblem or divine icon. Throughout December, I recorded only 2 dreams, the previous and the following, from Christmas morning. I'm in a big hospital. I'm there to see Mama and everyone is visiting, dozens of people. We are all hugging and greeting. Mama's in her bed and I'm explaining the situation to people. Suddenly, she is out in the hall in the wheelchair. She looks so good. She's sitting up and her eyes are open and focused. I'm shocked. I kneel down and she takes my hand in hers. She rubs the back of it with her thumb as if to comfort me. She doesn't speak, but she looks at me knowingly and has a slight smile. She nods slightly. It's so comforting. We begin to move down the hallway. She is almost floating in her wheelchair. Again, I woke in tears of grief and hope. The image of my mother, surrounded by love and healing, was an image that sustained me. The narrative in both these dreams was moving us forward, despite the stagnation in waking life. I was not the only one who was dreaming of my mother. We had a number of friends, her dream sisters, who shared their nighttime wanderings with her. In their dreams, she was out and about after the ordeal. She was awake and healing or mysteriously healed. The dream suggested that there was hope on the horizon, even if we could not see it with our eyes open. Nightly, we were encountering our own psyche, thanks to these shared dream journeys. As we were Psyche, so was my mother. I was playing the queen, Orwell was alive in others. By sharing our stories, our whole community became Psyche, the queen, and Orwell. Living one's myth doesn't mean simply living one myth. It means that one lives myth. It means mythical living. As I am many persons, so I am enacting pieces of various myths. We all played our many roles as we waited for the story to move forward. Then, upon returning home for a few short weeks, I became fully Orwell again and met my second task, where I was trampled with the anguish of my own emotions, let loose like the golden rams in the field. I took time to process as I headed through the desert to collect the water of death. These were my tears of grief. At this time, we were to the very extreme of what the doctor's projections, the very extreme of the doctor's projections, and hope was waning. I had to process the possibility of death to begin to move forward and embrace the hope of life again. This led me to an underworld journey. As time passed, the reports from the doctors became less and less promising. Once someone has been unresponsive for this long, the chances that they will wake with all their mental and physical faculties intact is rare. At this point, the mood began to shift. I know we were all trying to hold on to hope, but it is the love that pulled us through. Love suffers, never able to give up. The suffering in our tale has something to do with initiation, with changing the structures of consciousness. It was during this time of suffering through the desert of grief that I felt the truth of the grievances Orwell must share in front of the gods. In the novel's tale, she is stripped naked and permitted to read her complaint. She remarks that there must, whether the gods see it or not, be something great in the mortal soul. For suffering, it seems, is infinite, and our capacity without limit. However, her main argument to them is as follows. You said that a brute would devour her. Well, why didn't it? I'd have wept for her and buried what was left and built her a tomb and but to steal her love from me. How unfair to take Psyche and keep her for themselves. This was a sentiment I shared in my saddest and loneliest times. Why would the gods insist on taking her where we cannot follow? We'd rather she were ours and dead than yours and made immortal. This is the root of this level of suffering, the loss of love, but in this case, especially because it was not yet lost. The person we love is gone or away, but the love for them never fades. Perhaps this is the beauty and terror of the god Eros, the beast within the winged beauty. For the few weeks that I returned home, my mother was skirting immortality. I embraced the dark, the not knowing, the grief. I went fully into the pain, the sadness, the suffering that I'd been repressing. I wondered if it might have just been better that my mother had died. If she had, then at least we could move on. So many questions that felt like they would hurt too much to ask. All was laid bare, and it was terrible but necessary. In this time, I heard my own complaint to the gods. I found myself in Orwell's once veiled visage, naked, railing at the gods. As illustrated in the first dream, after I presented my grievances to my analyst, a transformation began. The young figure of my mother turned over and began to heal in the light. Once my fears were confronted with the light of consciousness, healing could begin. This is the message that it seemed the dreams were trying to bring me. There was given to me a certainty that this, at last, was my real voice, Orwell realizes. She recognizes the terrible and awesome face she carries within, one befitting the gods, on their level, needed to address them and allow them to view her. This moment of self-reflection becomes an imperative necessity, and for this, wisdom is needed. The complaint was the answer. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly. How can they meet us face to face until we have faces? There had to be a meeting point for the conscious and the unconscious, a moment of self-reflection and wisdom, a moment of consideration before the next step could be taken. In my journey, I was finally reaching this point. The veil was lifting, and I began to find my own voice, my own emotions, my own path. I had to speak my complaint to the gods in order to hear my voice again, to find myself. In the act of asking the terrible questions, almost as a response to my open embrace of this tension of opposites, I received the following dream from the unconscious in this time of darkness. I am with a large group of people gathering after disembarking from a train. We have to receive some kind of authentication to let a helicopter know where to take us next. A very tall, muscular Black man gets a beautiful picture of a female saint or the Madonna in a watercolor style on his phone. He shows it to all of us, and we begin to paint it in the grass on the field where we are waiting. I realize it's a landing circle. We all have our pants rolled up and are stomping through paint to create this beautiful image. There is liquid gold spread here and there. It is all around the outer ring of the picture. We are all walking through it in a circle. When the dance is done, the gold is set on fire. This calls the helicopter. The golden flaming ring, encompassing the female deity, was nothing less than numinous, divine. Out of the suffering, out of the tension I was holding, this image sprang from the unconscious, fully formed. I was torn between the grief and terror of what seemed at times a hopeless situation and the never-ending hope of infinite possibility. The abyss of absence is filled with the golden light of a very powerful spiritual and psychological presence. The golden light of love, the liquid gold circle dancing under our feet. Finally, well into January, almost 2 months after the aneurysm, My mother was moved from the nursing home back to the hospital in a last-ditch effort. Within hours, she woke and was responsive for the first time in 7 weeks. It seemed like a miracle. Since then, she completed a long period of rehab and recovery. I won't say she is who she was prior to that fateful day. How could she be? I am not who I was before that time either, but she is still here and living a life full of love. Love comes in all forms. All too often, our isolation has made us lose sight of the fact that our stories are segments of a greater story, but our individual wounds are collective wounds. Our individual stories, fragments of the larger collective story. Throughout those months, I felt the effect of the terrifying and fascinating mystery of life. It is the tale of love, a story of hurt and healing, a reflection of myth, a heroine's journey full of grief and hope. Thank you.
It was very beautiful, Sarah. It's a very, very moving story and beautiful miracle.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for sharing it with everybody here and also with Indelible.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to open it up, I assume, for if anybody has poetry or prose that they'd like to share. I think we have 20 more minutes.
Hey, Hedy, I believe Hedy had something to read. And Ray, I see Ray's hand up as well. Okay.
Thank you, Rula. Can I share screen in a minute?
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Okay, because I'll be reading a poem that was inspired by a painting by Remedios Varos. And although the poem really departed from the painting, I think you might like to take a peek at it. Okay, so can you see the painting? Insomnia.
Yep.
I have, yeah, that happens to me quite a lot. Last night, for example, I was up at 3 and only managed to go back to sleep for a few hours this morning. But in any case, this is my poem. It's a pantoum, and it is titled, "Or How a Lover's Skin Shivers Like Moonlight Over Water." Let's dream of the full moon through transparent roofs. Deafened walls watch you sleepwalking with eyes wide open. Embrace this wake as sand awakened by dew at dawn. Follow the flames glow as hours glide over prayer beads. Deafened walls watch you sleepwalking with eyes wide open. A lost mobilis in mobili, rocked by the tide's ebb and flow. Follow the flames glow as hours glide over prayer beads. Let's store worries in a drawer and throw the key away. A lost mobilis in mobili, rocked by the tide's ebb and flow. Shake every speck of stardust from your hair and thoughts. Let's store worries in a drawer and throw the key away. Be happy you've just crossed one task out of a long list. Shake every speck of heart of stardust from your hair and thoughts. Don't acknowledge yourself as an avatar of a higher self. Be happy you've just crossed one task out of a long list. Let's invert it all, climb the slightest beam of light. Don't acknowledge yourself as an avatar of a higher self. Draw your strength from a phoenix riding its tsunami. Let's invert it all, climb the slightest beam of light. See how a lover's skin shivers like moonlight over water.
That was gorgeous, Hedy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love your reading of Remedios Varo. I mean, it's just the ekphrastic poetry that you've done on her work is just wonderful.
I forgot to mention that this is part of a new manuscript that I have just finished in December and submitted it to my publisher. And so there are many poems, as you've read quite a few of them, inspired by Remedios Varo, and some surrealist art, women, it's mostly women artists, surrealistic artists or contemporary artists.
Congratulations, Hedy. I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope so.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you,
And
Hedy.
Sarah?
We always love having you here.
Thank you. Thank you. I loved your presentation. I still have all these images, all those ideas, and of course, the way you work through your own experience. It's extremely moving and very beautifully done. Thank you.
Thank you, Hedy. And next, Raymond, did you want to share?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
In one way, I hate to break the beautiful conversation we've been having with the imagination and turn back to current events in the outside world, but I certainly, I'm sure all of you have been so upset about what's happening in Ukraine. And what happens with me is things just build up, and then I have to write something. So I wrote this on Thursday. It's a poem called If You Were in Mariupol. How would you feel after they shell your grandmother's ancestral home, and you find her clutching her cat, staring breathless into the sky? The soldiers are in her kitchen, eating breakfast at her table. They have taken the turquoise ring you gave her as a birthday gift. You walked those streets just last year, drank coffee inside that cafe with your Ukrainian cousin, who now lies upon its cold floor. The Holocaust Memorial has been hit by artillery. Here, everyone is Jewish, for shells are indiscriminate. A child kneels beside her mother, her tears her only communion, for she knows nothing of evil and has not learned to pray. I am sipping coffee in Maine as light snow drifts from a gray sky. If I were in Mariupol, I would be fighting for my life.
Thank you, Ray. That was very moving. I know for me, I process a lot of things while writing too. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Next, Cassie Fielding is interested in sharing. Cassie, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to share a poem. I'm quite nervous. I'm not used to sharing my poetry outside of kind of a small group of people. So thank you. I was really related to what Adam was saying about the way he approaches writing poetry. It's kind of, I would relate the way I write to active imagination or collaborative imagination, as we were saying in the chat. So a lot of times I don't know what my poetry means. I'm not even sure I ought to know what it means on a rational level. But anyway, I'll get on read one. And I picked this one to read because I've noticed the theme of femininity, and they're coming up in my poetry as well. So I don't know if that's a collective thing that comes up for a lot of people. But anyway, this piece is called Moon Who Is Not My Mother. Remnant crust of one-eyed sleep, moon, you are not my mother. You are a fever dream she had before night was night and darkness shone a light of violence lucent. Look at your half-daughter, slick with echo silver, thrown back bend of the blinded birth of a pearl. I feed on virgin milk and claim stakes to the fatted colostra of art, an instrument of an instrument, diluted, macerated, a pale shadow, a hovering voice faced to the curl of ocean lip. Moon, I am too afraid to wet my feet. And she knows my craven mist, moon who is not my mother. She knows and she waits, readiness eternal. Her eye is the mouth that does not hunger, exhumes as it consumes, a tenderness of bite more agonizing than a plunder of knives, her dormant gaze. I hide in the glow of your waning moon. I too wait, a halfling thing without a mother. Thank you.
Beautiful, Kathy.
Thank you so much.
You're here with us and that you felt moved to share.
Yeah, thank you.
Would anyone else like to join the open mic? Nassim.
Hi. Yeah, I was sort of looking through some of my poetry here and seeing if there was anything vaguely on theme. And I wrote a series of short poems sort of about an anima encounter. And I thought maybe I'd share the last three in the series. So they're sort of written as these 14-line poems, sort of in the style of diary entries. A fete winds through rose streets where all wait. These empty A fete winds through rose streets where all await. These empty hands I fail to give. Memory shaken with dogs and desert, arms bound to a staff, return of usual pains, hesitant brothers lash against a love-bound world whose joys insult, unable to quiet its embrace with even this. And night finds your scent, feels you, though tracks and hours away. And the next one. Flight to friends, to friends, to friends, from morning's last until an end to efforts. And I am spent, and spent more than tomorrow will afford, though it will pay. What do you dream in weight of me, and why and how in another city? And the final one. I am late to a party's walk through dampened streets and pulled off afterward to a place I thought I could escape. This same magic calls to me, though now I know its names and diffident meanings of its words. When friends leave, I do not follow. What owns my heart? Through all my years, dim visions call.
Thank you, Nassim. Wonderful trio there. I definitely felt that tied into the theme that is coming out today. Anyone else? Not, I think Rula, did you want to share one?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I don't know if I've read this poem before here, but it's called Fleur de sel. In French, it means the flower of salt. And well, during a little bit of art space research that I was doing, poetry, basically poetry-based poetry arts-based research about the my Hellenic Levantine roots. And this one was a meditation on the salinas, or the salt beds in the Mediterranean. And it's called Fleur de Sel. I didn't know that there was salt and the flower of salt. That was something I discovered and I, kind of learned a little bit about this summer. And there are mythic images that also join Phoenician myths with Greek mythology as well. So you will find Yam and Poseidon. Snowflakes of summer sterilize the face of the sea with mineral mandalas at the dinner table where Yam and Poseidon sat, sharing bread and salt, fleur de sel, a brackish kiss, crusts on a closing wound, hushing the depth into saline flavors of secrecy. Mare Nostrum, waves once a dance floor, a spring of journeys, but now in the rarity of relish, water is a flammable destination. Let the crystal dust rise like a chrysalis for the dormant. So this was Fleur de Sel. There's another one also on the same theme, and it also involves food, of course. It's called Pantry. The old pantry sprouts beyond the mustard seeds, lining the eyes of fava beans, like libs filling in the blanks on the shelves, mixing new worlds of oil and vinegar, a clary sage in islands of loose syrup. Between neither east nor west lies a land, a middle child syndrome. Change sings not in hymns, but in bergamot peels, grating against flasks of pomegranate molasses, hiding genies and stories in molten gold magma. Plums and almonds exist here in double being, once pickled and once dried. In perfect olive jars, they wait to turn bitter. The salt grains in the middle reaching out for rebirth. Thank you.
Thank you, Rula. As always, such rich imagery. I can almost taste your poetry.
Thank you, Sarah.
And I want to just really quick, everybody, another group that we do applause like this. So can we give Rula a big round of applause for Psychreative's first year and all she's meant to all of us.
Thank you.
You've done such a wonderful job, and we just love being with you every month.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone. Thank you. I mean, I really owe this to everyone who's here, and I'm so happy that we've been doing this for a year now, and looking forward to more sessions like this. And Sarah, would you want to say something about the call for submissions for your journal?
Yeah. So my journal, The Rose in the World, we have a submission call coming or open now. The deadline is March 18th, and I'm going to put the link to the rose in the chat. The theme in the rose always sort of emerges out of the unconscious, but it's going to be published around Easter. So I've already gotten some submissions that are very timely for spring and Easter and all of that. So I have a feeling that's where it's moving. So would love for anyone to submit. We take all kinds of creative work, from poetry to long form essay to paintings, photographs, a little bit of everything. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I also want to, again, extend the invitation to the Festival of Literature, which will be happening this month from the 28th of March to the 15th of April. And we'll be having so many great poets and writers and screenwriters and playwrights. So it's going to be a jam-packed 3-week schedule. So we'll be having, I'll just give you a quick round of who will be opening the festival and who will be finishing it off. So it will start with Naomi Shihabnai, who is the Young People Poets Laureate in the US. That will be on March 28th. And then Andre Nafis Sahili will be a poet, translator, critic, and editor, will also be giving a session. And then we have Raymond Khouri, who is a screenwriter and novelist, author of The Last Templar. I think many of you would have read it. And then we have Maria Taylor, a poet, critic, and reviewer on the 31st of March. April 1st, we will have a poetry across the disciplines panel. So it will feature poets from many different disciplines like music, medicine, food, law, psychology, science, and technology. And this will include Chun Yu, Norbert Hirschhorn, Fuad, Helen Demetriadis, and Fiona Sampson. And the second week, we will start with a panel on eco-poetics featuring Ruth Padel. Everyone knows Ruth Padel, and Abhay K, poet diplomat Abhay K, who has also written the Earth Anthem. So this will be an exciting panel talking about eco-poetics, the environment, and the importance of poetry playing a role in environmental awareness. Tuesday, April 5th, we have Antonia Taylor, who will be talking to writers about building an author brand. Antonia Taylor is a poet herself. She's also a communications expert, especially in the fields of creativity. Wednesday, April 6th, we will be having a session with Romaline Anti, who is a poet, a nurse, and a psychotherapist. And she'll be discussing bridging two different worlds, the world of poetry and the world of nursing and medicine as well. And then Thursday, April 7th, we'll be featuring Anthony Anaxagoru, who'll be writing about heritage aesthetics. He'll be speaking to us about his new book. And then Friday, April 8th, we have two sessions, one that is at 1 p.m. here, so that's pretty early in the UK, around 9 a.m. And well, in the States, PST, that's 1 a.m. PST. But this will be by Zach Zakar, who is a Montessori trainer and storyteller, joining us from Australia. And she'll talk about the importance of storytelling. And then we have a panel, Poetry and Diaspora, which will feature various poets who will talk about the subject of the diaspora and how it affects their poetry. And this will feature Andre Nafis Sahili, Anthony Anaxagoru, Antonia Taylor, Maria Taylor, Omar Sabagh, Abhay K, and Ruth Patel. April 11th, we have Sabrina Mahfouz, who is a writer, spoken word poet, playwright, and radio presenter. She'll be talking about her latest works. And Adam and I will be giving a joint session on the 12th of April called Depth Poetry and Alchemical Poetics. And Mona Arshi, who is a poet, a novelist, and a lawyer, will be speaking on April 13th. And April 14th, we have Patricia Finney and Sarah Smith, who will be talking about modern adaptations of Shakespeare. So we hope to see you all there. And this is going to be an exciting festival. Last year's festival was great. And this year we're also hoping to have the same fun that we had last year. So thank you all for joining. And don't forget, April 30th with Susan, we will be discussing the Sacred Well murders. All right. So good night, everyone, or good morning.
Thanks so much, Rula. Thanks, everyone. It's been lovely to hearing all the great work. Keep in touch.
Have a great weekend.
Bye. Have a great weekend.